Welcome to How We Belong, the podcast where we explore the question, what does it mean to belong in today's modern world? I'm your host, Kylie Hodges, and I am thrilled to bring you today's guest. She is a working mother of four who uses her platform on TikTok and Instagram to share her thoughts on the mental load, parenting, and her career. Her goal is to raise awareness about the mental load of motherhood and advocate for equitable relationships for couples. Additionally, she's a passionate advocate for affordable and accessible childcare options, working to make family life more manageable for all. Welcome, Paige Turner. Hi, Paige.
Hi. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you here. Right before we started recording, I was double checking because I met you years ago and I actually couldn't remember where we actually met, but I always like to share where I've met our guests. So Paige and I met years ago when you were living in Los Angeles, which is where I am currently. And we were in the entertainment world and happened to
Yeah,
cross paths. You've since moved out east. You live in outside Boston, correct?
correct. Yes.
What has changed for you since I saw
Huh.
you almost a decade ago?
It has been a decade this year since I
Yeah.
moved home from LA. So yeah, it's been 10 years. Everything's changed. My career, I'm
Mhm.
married, got four kids, live in the suburbs, everything's
Yeah.
a little bit different these days. But also I guess not much, right? Still on
Yeah.
social media, still doing the same kinds of things, just in a different way.
Yeah. So it's so crazy because, of course, we'd stay in touch over the years and followed each other on social, but about maybe a year or less ago was when I started seeing you pop up on my FYP on TikTok and you were talking
Yeah.
about the mental load. And I went, wait, that's Paige. What
Yeah.
what is going on here? And so we got back in touch and it's fascinating to see your content take off. And of course, that's what I want to talk with you today about is the mental load, your story behind it, and how you even got here. So I would love to hear, first of all, what even got you into the place of making a TikTok and talking about the mental load? Because correct me if I'm wrong, it can't be the most fun topic.
Mm,
It's an
yeah,
exhausting thing, right?
it can be. Yes,
Okay.
because it brings out a lot of different emotions. It kind of triggers
Yeah.
people that the
Yeah.
commentary around the mental load. So I started posting on TikTok just for fun, but mostly because at work, I work in e-commerce apparel businesses. We use TikTok for advertising. Like it's our marketing tool.
Hmm.
And so it was semi new. We were all kind of playing around with it. And me and someone else on the team just started posting for fun, right? Let's get familiar with this app. Let's understand it. Let's post some content. And mine was very just silly stuff about motherhood and just commentary that I had on what it's like being a mother and being a working parent and all the things. And I didn't intentionally start posting about the mental load. I was just sharing my experience at the time and touched on it. But every time I would bring it up, it would go pretty viral. And I would say, oh, interesting. People feel very strongly about this topic. And I came to that topic personally. The reason I was talking about it was because during the pandemic, or right before the pandemic, I became a mother. And within 3 years, I went from 0 kids to four. And the mental load became very heavy for me. And I didn't have words to describe it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know why I was feeling frustrated and burnt out and resentful towards my husband. I didn't know what was happening. And once I was able to put words to it and understand it and have conversations with my partner, we were able to make really big changes in our lives to both be happier and to be more efficient in our home. And so I just lived it. I lived it and I was able to start talking about it. And I found that the number one thing women were saying to me, specifically women were saying to me online, was, oh my gosh, I couldn't articulate this. Thank you for saying the words. I couldn't. I felt very lonely in this experience, and now I don't. And so that
Wow.
really was what drove me forward and why I continued to talk about it.
Yeah. So and if you don't remember, that's fine, but where along the path of going from 0 to 4 kids in 3 years, oh my God, by the way,
Yeah.
did you learn the term or hear about the term the mental load? Do you remember that?
I don't remember hearing the term itself, but I do remember hearing Eve Rodsky, who's the author of Fair Play, on a podcast. And she was talking about the division of labor in a home. And she brought up mental load, I believe, but more than anything, it's about domestic labor and caretaking and how to share that work equitably in a marriage and a partnership. And that was my aha moment. That was hearing somebody else say it out loud was just it just relieved so much for me. And once I heard that, I just started looking into it. Honestly, I started listening to more. I read her book, I read other books, and I just started to learn because I didn't want to feel the way I was feeling. And I wanted to understand more as to how I got there. And that really was that jumping off point for me, kind of hearing her on that podcast, sharing her experience. It felt like looking in a mirror.
Mm. So, in service of the word belonging and keeping this podcast around what belonging looks like in different places and situations,
Mhm.
can you articulate for me what it felt like, what it feels like to belong when you are sharing with someone else who feels similarly, experiencing the mental load? What does the mental load look like? What does it feel like?
Yeah, so the mental load is different for everyone. And that's the thing that could be hard about it, right? Because
Mm.
um, it's definitely a term that has become gendered online, but isn't gendered, in my opinion, right?
Mm.
Every person has mental load. It's just the running list of things you need to remember and do in your brain, right? And my friend Zach talks about it like open tabs on a computer, right? Or on your phone. You keep all these open tabs so you don't forget stuff. And that's what the mental load is in your brain. It's remembering you need more ketchup and that your other kid ran out of shoes because their feet keep growing like crazy and that you need to fill out this paperwork for work. It's just all the things that are in your brain at all times that go into your everyday life that aren't tangible, that nobody can see, right? And so
Yeah.
oftentimes it can feel very lonely and isolating because it's invisible. So nobody sees this mental load. Nobody knows what you're thinking about at all times. And so unless you say it out loud, they can't acknowledge it. You can't acknowledge it. It just is behind closed doors. And actually, it can be really isolating and lonely to feel like you're carrying the bulk of the mental load in the context of parenting or a household because it's a lot. There is a lot going on. And it seems silly to say that there's like quote unquote mental load that goes into making dinner, but there is. There's a lot of thought that goes into the actual act of making dinner, which maybe isn't that hard.
So, where do you think is the disconnect between the person experiencing mental load and the person? Because I guess I should clarify, it sounds to me like the mental load happens mostly in families where there is one person experiencing it and the other not. If there is a partnership, or if you're a single parent, you're bound to have a lot of, you're carrying the mental load because who else is? Is that
Yeah.
an accurate assumption?
I think the mental load actually exists in all different contexts, right? I think
Okay.
about even my siblings and I, right? There's four of
Yeah.
us. Mother's Day is coming
Ah,
up.
yeah.
My sister and I are talking about what we're doing for our mom and what we're buying for our mom, and we're sending each other ideas and reminding each other that we need to buy things. My brother just asks us how much to Venmo us, right? Like
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
the mental load, right? So it's the fact that we are thinking about it, remembering it, clocking things in our brain of things our mom likes, places she
Yeah.
likes to go, food she likes to eat, things she's mentioned in passing. That is the mental work going into making sure that she has a nice Mother's Day. Whereas, this is not a jab at my brother, but my brother's not the one texting us. He'll call us and say, "What are we doing for Mother's Day?" But
Hmm.
maybe not ready with ideas because it just hasn't been something that he's thinking about. And that's the mental load outside of a marital context, outside of a parenting context, right? It's
Yep.
just who's thinking about these things and remembering them. Even dog parents, right? I'm sure you've experienced this, right? Who's booking the vet appointments? Do we buy the flea and tick medicine? Are we paying the dog walker? When's the dog walker coming? Are we going on vacation? Do we need a boarder? These are all the things that go
Yeah.
into life. And so it's not always within the context of a relationship, but oftentimes it can be unbalanced in relationships, sibling relationships, parent relationships, all of it.
Yeah.
Um, because of just how society has kind of, especially with men and women, but raised us to believe what is ours versus what is someone else's responsibility.
Yeah, that just reminded me. That was a great example. Thank you for sharing that because no, I don't
Sure.
have children. And recently I was talking to a friend and I said, I'm the youngest. There's me
Mm.
and my older brother. So I'm the only girl, but I'm the youngest. And I had said, do I give off youngest child energy? And he said, actually, no, you seem too responsible. You give off big sister, oldest sister energy. And I said, that's accurate because in certain situations in the family, I do what you just articulated. And I just thought it was because, I think I take after my mom. My mom is like that and my dad is not. Um, but it absolutely seems like it's a bigger societal systemic issue.
Hmm.
It's really interesting to put things into perspective of just like how you had said, there's no offense to my brother, or, I love my brother, but same with mine and same with my husband. When it came to having our dog and booking vet appointments, yes, that was me. Or he would come to me and check and say, can I do this? Should I do this? Like he's a very helpful helper, but not necessarily taking the initiative. And it just sort of became that way. It's not
Hmm.
like I started saying, hey, run everything by me. I'm the decision maker in this family. It just happens that way. What do you think is it that is making things happen that way?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is societal, right? There's gender norms, there's societal norms, there's the stories that we tell boys and girls growing up about who they are and what's important, right? We tell women that they're naturally more nurturing and caring and empathetic. And we tell men that they are smart and logical and hard workers and protectors and providers and all these things, right? And it's not always super obvious in the way that this messaging comes about, but it's even just the way we talk about things like money or how we encourage people to go to college, what we tell them to go into, right? What
Yeah.
kind of careers we talk about with men versus women and why, right? Oftentimes women are encouraged to go into teaching because they have mother's hours, right? That's a common thing you hear that women are told. It's like, oh, teachers get summers off with their kids. Why are we not saying those things to men, right? And
Mhm.
so oftentimes I think it's just all of the messaging we're hearing at all times about men and women and boys and girls and what it means to be a woman or a man. And whether or not somebody says outright, Paige, it's your job to remember your mother's birthday for the rest of your life. I took that on because I was told that I'm a caring, nurturing, empathetic person. And so therefore it's my job to make people feel cared for,
Ooh,
right? And so they placed value on that for me, when in reality, anybody can make someone feel cared for if they put enough time and effort into it. But if you're told that that's not something you're going to be held accountable to or seen as valuable for you, then you're not going to put stock in it. And I think
yeah.
that's where we get so off path with each other here.
I mean, this just, my instinct is like, so where do we go from here? Like, we know it exists, and we're talking about it, but like, if it's a societal issue, it just feels so big, so heavy, so out of our hands.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do to start shifting society so that the mental load is evenly distributed?
I think there are, yes, it's a huge problem, first and foremost. I think it's so ingrained in society that I think it's going to take a very, very long time for this to change. I think the things that we each can do in our own lives is address the way we speak to each other, the way we put things into context, right? Instead of saying, oh yeah, my husband's helping with the groceries. Well, he's not helping. He's getting groceries because we eat them, and he does too. So he's doing the groceries. He's not helping me by doing that, right? This is for our home. And so having those kinds of conversations, changing the way we speak about these things, even the way that we as women too sometimes get taken advantage of in a workplace also, right? Oftentimes in a workplace, women will be tasked with things that are outside of their job description. Hey, do you mind ordering the swag for the holiday party? Hey, do
Mm,
you mind getting a card for so and so's birthday? Why are we asking women to do that? Why aren't we asking, everybody on the team to participate in these things? And so as a manager, being conscious of who on my team I look to for those things and what that looks like as an employee, sometimes pushing back on those things and saying, hey, my plate's full right now. Why don't you ask John? He might have some time to go buy a birthday card, right? Having
Mhm.
those conversations, being willing to kind of push back on them, it's not easy. It's difficult. And oftentimes there can be repercussions, right? Like when I had these conversations with my husband, they were difficult. He was incredibly defensive, which I understand because
Mhm.
he's standing there saying, I'm a good dad, I'm a good husband, yet you keep telling me that I don't do enough. And you keep telling me that I'm not showing up or carrying my fair share. You're making me feel like a bad guy. And the problem with that is there's so much of our humanity is tied into this where he thinks he's valuable. He's been told he's valuable in different ways. And he's like, I'm here. I'm doing all the things that I was told I was supposed to do. And you're telling me it's not enough. So now I'm confused and frustrated and angry and defensive. And it takes a lot of humility to move through that, like to move past that, for him to say, like, no, like emotions aside, let's have a conversation about it. So that way we can get on the same page. But it wasn't without some really difficult times. And so that's the problem. It goes so far outside of our homes too, right? Into like
Yeah.
paid leave for men versus women. How do men take their sick time when their kids are sick? Or is it women doing it? It's just everywhere that it can be so hard to think about where to start, honestly.
Yeah. It sounds like when in a moment of overwhelm and this, like, the problem is getting too big for me to grasp, the grounding moment is the change is happening right here in articulating it. And that's the best that
Mhm.
we can do for right now. And trust that maybe by the time our kids grow up, it will be a different type of world that they live in.
I hope so. Yeah. And I think if you are a parent, it's about making it known to your children what it looks like to have equity and to, place importance on things for boys and girls that maybe doesn't fit into those gender norms, right?
Yeah.
Saying to my son, like, hey, your sister is really excited about her dance recital. Should we make her a card? Right? Should we get excited for her? Involving him in those things that you might not traditionally do so. Those little things make a difference. But I think to your point, honestly, it's just talking about it. For so long, we've been told don't talk about these things. That's negative. Like just look at the bright side.
Yep.
You
Be
know,
grateful.
be thankful. Yeah, the blessings, count your blessings, like all of those
Yeah.
things. Yeah, you sent me a DM yesterday, but somebody yesterday told me that expecting our partners to show up for us is toxic. And it's just one of those things where it's like it is hard to say these things out loud because there will be people who push against it. But the
Yeah.
more we normalize it, the more normal it will become. If we're all talking about it, then it's no longer this taboo thing that people can tell you to be quiet about.
Right. Yeah. That was the next thing I wanted to address you about. You've gotten some hate, which I guess that means it's resonating and your message
Yeah.
is working if you're receiving pushback. I the note that I put was I wrote toxic mommy culture. This person was reacting to what you were saying. Uh they said something along the lines of, I'm going to die on this hill, that if you don't speak up, if you don't say what you want, you can't be resentful of your partner not reading your mind,
Mhm.
which out of context makes sense. That's a valid thing to be like, if you don't say what you want, you can't expect people to be mind readers.
Totally.
And yet, it's expected on someone, probably women, to be the one to predict the future for
Mhm.
everyone so that everyone else's life is easier and better.
Yeah.
And this person used the term toxic mommy culture when talking about your video. And that actually, I think I DM'd you and just wrote, woof,
You
because
did, yeah.
it's like hearing the term toxic mommy culture being thrown around at you, but also just in general is like, this is not fighting the good fight. This is not the helpful way to go about it. It's not even a helpful discourse when we start using terms like that.
Mm-mm.
How do you I'm a very sensitive little soul on the internet. I've only had one video go very slightly viral, and everyone in the comments on TikTok was calling me a dumb bitch. And I
Ugh,
was like,
no.
it was the beginning of COVID, so maybe I was just very
Yeah.
sensitive. But I was like, I can't go on TikTok, and I stayed off it for like 2 years because of that. How do
Mm,
you protect yourself from getting too emotionally wrapped up in this conversation on the internet?
it's hard. It's really hard. I think the thing I do to protect myself is I don't look.
Oh, yeah.
Transparently. You know, I do look and I engage, but when I see things that are just so out of pocket, or just so untrue or off base, even oftentimes it's just like out of left field. Like it has nothing to do with what we're talking about, right? But it's just meant to
Yeah.
be hurtful or yeah, to cause harm to someone, myself or somebody in my comments. I I block a lot. I
Good.
block a lot. I don't look. And that's just for my peace of mind, right? I could
Mm.
go in there and try to block everybody and respond to everybody, but I can't. Like it's too hard to filter through that every single day. But there is enough in there to validate and for me to feel like I know I'm providing value. I know that there are women out there who need to hear this and men too. I get messages from men. There was this one guy
Good.
actually who sent me a DM that said, every time I see your content, I have to decide whether or not I'm willing to be triggered today or not. And
Whoa.
and then he said, it's not that it's not valuable, it's just that it does cause me a lot of discourse, like personally. It triggers me, and I have to be in the right place to process what you're telling me, like in these
Yeah.
videos.
Yeah.
And so I love that kind of message because it's like, I get it. It is triggering. It's hard to hear. It causes a reaction, obviously, but doesn't mean it doesn't have value. Doesn't mean it's not something of importance. And that's not me saying I'm important. It's just like the messaging, the conversation about the mental load is one that needs to be had.
Yeah.
And it's just, yeah, it's difficult. But people also feel so comfortable behind a computer, as we all know. And so I just try to take it with a grain of salt and think like, if they passed me in the grocery store, they weren't going to say anything. So I'm not going to listen to
Yeah.
it now. The same way I
Good
wouldn't
for
have heard
you.
it in the grocery store. Yeah. But
Very good for you. Also, major respect to that guy who
mm,
is clearly being so honest with himself on a daily basis about where he lies in the
yeah.
quote unquote problem and is willing to do something about it. Like, I hope that guy is listening to this. I really admire
I
and
know.
respect his honesty. And also that he was willing to say that online.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, that's an
Yeah. He
open
said it
invitation
in a
for a pile
DM.
on. Okay.
He said it in a
Still.
DM, which is still better than nothing. And there
Yeah.
are guys who will get in my comments and say things, but it can be difficult, right? Because the
Yeah.
second they say something, other men who want to kind of combat that, come at them. And I have a lot of people who, similar to you, maybe are like are a little bit more sensitive to these comments. They'll
Mhm.
DM me instead of commenting. They'll say, "Hey, I wanted to leave a comment, but I'm not at a place to hear the feedback." So
Yeah.
I'm like, that's
Yeah.
totally fine.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about what the conversation looks like when you are articulating with someone that you need help with the mental load.
Mm,
And you don't have to give an example of you with your husband. Your relationship is private, but like, what does that look like when someone is clearly swimming in or really buried in the mental load? There is someone else who could be supporting them with it and they're not.
hmm.
Um, and it's probably creating a buildup of resentment and frustration and tension on the person carrying that mental load. What would you say to someone who's like, I need to talk about it and I don't know what to say or where to start?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I suggest if you can before having a conversation. One is if you're not like in personal therapy, it's great if you can begin individual therapy because I think you're able to process your emotions there and then work on how you want to articulate things in your real life. But that's a privileged take, right? Not everybody can access therapy, and I understand that. And so if not, what I suggest is, and I have not always taken this advice for myself, which is try not to do it in the heat of the moment, right? So if you feel like something has happened and it's triggering you and it's really bringing to the forefront this mental load conversation and you want to say something right then and there, but emotions are high, it's probably not going to be productive. I think we all know that,
Mhm.
right? The sleep on it
Yeah.
idea, like just sleep on it. But I think it's important to be able to go back to that scenario, right? Or even in the moment say, hey, I'm feeling frustrated that this is happening at the moment. I don't want to have a deep conversation about it, but I want us to come back to this. Can we talk about it tomorrow? Or can we talk, whenever's appropriate for your home? I remember in our marriage, we have 4 small kids, so things happen in the moment. And I would say something, and then my husband would get defensive and get upset. And I would say to him, hey, 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 not in front of our kids, right? We're not having this conversation in front of our kids. We're not having this conversation right now. We can't truly connect right now because there's 4 little people screaming at us and needing our attention. And so we're not actually communicating in an effective way. So I'm not going to have the conversation right now. I want to revisit it when we can actually have a thoughtful conversation. And so there's that, which is like, when are you having this conversation? And then it's, how are you coming to the conversation? What I've found to be really important for my husband and I is for me to say to him, please listen to what I'm saying, not what you're feeling about what I'm saying for a second, right? Because I would say, hey, you're really not holding up your end of the bargain with X, Y, and Z when it comes to the kids. And he'd be like, you're right, I'm a bad dad. I'm like, I didn't say that. Like, I didn't say you're a bad dad. I'm saying that you're not helping fill out the mounds of paperwork that comes home from school each week. And that is causing me stress and it's overwhelming me and I'm looking for your help. That's not me saying you're a bad dad. Those are not the same thing, right? And so I think sometimes setting the stage and saying like, this is not a critique on you as a human being or a parent, but we need to have a conversation about the actual logistics of parenting or of our home or of our pet or whatever it is. We need to have a conversation about the logistics. I also think, which I learned from Fair Play, and I have a spreadsheet on this, but being able to list out tasks and say, these are all the things that happen in our home. These are all of the things. And putting your name next to the ones you do and him, the ones he does. And then it's less about emotions. It's like, let's look on paper, right? I know when we did it, I had like 65 and he had like 15. And I'm like, does this feel like,
Yeah.
you don't even have to say anything in that instance. You're like, you can look at it. I don't know. Like it's not equitable. And obviously equitable is different for every home because whether you're working or staying at home or you have kids, no kids, it's different for everyone. But it's pretty easy to see when you do it that way.
Yeah. The data doesn't lie.
Exactly.
It removes emotion. That's such a great point. When you can put it on paper, have some facts, then it removes the emotion and the personalization of it and just says, this is the reality of what's happening here. Does this seem right to you? To me, it doesn't seem right. I would like to see a change.
Yeah.
Spot on.
And there is emotion behind it, right? Because it's like, for some of us, the way we were raised implicates how we view our home cleanliness or how we like things done or why certain things are important to us. And that is important to get to. But for me, that's like a next step, which is like, okay, let's talk about what's happening and why it's not working. And then when you get into the nitty gritty, you can say, hey, it's actually very important for me for our kids to play sports. And I know you think it's a lot, but it was so valuable to me. And this is how it impacted my life. And that's why I feel this way. And you can have those conversations now that you two are aligned on what your goal is, where you're trying to go with the conversation.
Very good. When you used the term logistics, it reminded me that, so I don't have kids yet. My husband Omar and we want kids soonish, in the next few years. And I actually have a big fear around it's not the kids, but I'll say kids creating a strain in our marriage, and that our marriage is so great. I love life with him right now, kid free. And I grew up seeing strain in my parents' marriage whenever I was just being a kid. Like whether I was being naughty or not, something could and would happen that would create disagreements. And so I've had a lot of fear around kids creating a strain on a marriage, and that I don't want to quote unquote ruin our marriage or anything like that. Not saying that would happen, but it's a fear. And I have thought about, when I get pregnant, anticipating, okay, what's the plan? What is the strategy? If I were to think about this as like building a business, what are the systems in place? What are the like what are the workflows that could happen so that we can start experimenting with, um, passing tasks off just like we were in the workplace so that we don't ever get to a boiling point or a point where I'm holding all this resentment against
Hmm.
him because he's not reading my mind, as that
Yeah.
person would say.
Yeah. I think I talk a lot about the logistics of parenting because oftentimes when women especially say like, I hate cooking dinner or laundry is the worst, people will say, oh my gosh, you signed up to be a mother. And it's like, laundry has nothing to do with parenting. It's just a consequence of parenting, right?
Yeah.
It's not
You have to
actually
do
part of
laundry
parenting.
without kids.
Exactly. And so it's the logistics, right, of having
Mhm.
children. And some things you can outsource, some things you have to do yourself. And so I would say having a conversation well before having kids about what the logistics of parenting will look like is so important. Then the second layer of that mental load is actually the parenting itself, because oftentimes, again, women take on the mental load very early in parenting. Trying to conceive is typically placed on women, where it's like, is she tracking her ovulation? Is she managing her cycle? Right? She is the one in charge. Is she taking the pregnancy test? Like, what does that look like? And then you carry that baby, or the birthing person carries that baby, and they take a lot of accountability during that time. And so then when the baby's born, so much has already been placed on her to be responsible for, to be accountable for, to know in advance of this child, that it often starts to just slowly snowball to her thinking about, how do we feed this baby? What kind of parenting style are we going to do? What kind of school are they going to go? Did we research childcare options, right? Oftentimes, this dynamic sets it up so that all of that starts to pile on mom. And that's not even the logistics, right? That's just developmental stuff. And so I think it's important to invite men in from the beginning. Like, they should be sharing your like cycle app, tracking app. Like, they should be on there and know just as much as you do. They should be at those doctor's appointments. And oftentimes people are like, what's the point? It's like, the same point as me being at those appointments, right? Like, we're both having this baby. And so having those conversations, involving each other in conversations about, how are we going to do food? Are we doing baby led weaning? Or are we doing, purees? Why are we doing that? Come with your thoughts and your opinions. Let's have a conversation about this. But oftentimes what you mentioned is, people will say, look to mom and say, so what are we doing for food?
Mhm.
And they have expected her to do the research and ask the doctors and follow all the accounts on Instagram to decide how they're going to feed their child. And dad's there to do it. He's happy to help feed, but he didn't do any of the work to make the decision. And that's also part of it, right? So there's the logistics of the actual tasks. But with parenting, I love when people say this because I relate to it so much, which is like, we became parents on the same day. I I didn't know more than you. I only know more because I put more time into it, and because I've spent more time thinking about it and researching it, not because I inherently know more as a woman. I don't.
Yeah.
Like, I think we're all blind until you become a parent, and then it's who's putting in the work to learn.
Yeah. This reminded me of, there is a show called Girls Five Eva. Have you heard of it?
I haven't watched it yet, but I've seen the trailer.
It's one of my favorites. It's very funny. For people who are like, what the hell is she talking about? It's a show by Tina Fey, so you should already know it's very funny. And it basically is about four women who were pop stars. They were in a like Spice Girls type group in the early 2000s, and now that they're in their mid to late 40s, they have reunited, and are back at it again, and it's very silly. And the lead singer, played by Sarah Bareilles, has a husband and one little boy as
Mm.
a child. And there is an episode actually where the dad, I think, is a stay-at-home dad. The husband is a stay-at-home dad, and she's not only a pop star, but also like runs a family restaurant. And she was dropping her son off at school, and she was with her husband as well. And all the moms turned to Sarah Bareilles and said, is your little boy coming to the karate practice later? And, oh, we looped you in an email. And she just defaulted to, okay, great. I'm going to respond to the email, but I'm also so busy and I have all these things. And halfway through the episode, it occurred to her, wait, why am I doing this? I can pass it off to my husband. It makes more sense for distributing the tasks to him. So it's like
Yeah.
such a brilliant example of the mental load without, I don't think they ever say the term, but really articulating the irony and the, um, you know, the lack of logic really in just defaulting to
Mm-hmm.
the mom, when in this situation, like, it doesn't make sense because the mom is the working parent and the dad is the stay-at-home parent and she's the
Yeah.
busiest, but it's because she's the mom that task defaulted to her.
Yeah.
Um, a final question that I wanted to ask you about, a lot of this has been looking at the mental load from the perspective of parenting, having children, and being in a cisgender
Mm-hmm.
heteronormative relationship. What are you hearing about from your audience for unique different families and couples? Like, what does the mental load carrying it and distributing it look like for different types of families, whether that's queer or just different types of family sizes too?
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely heard from people, like, first and foremost, without kids, right? I don't
Uh-huh.
think you have to have kids to know what this feels like. I
Yeah.
think it's like I said, even with my siblings, right? If you're in any kind of a relationship with other human beings where you have shared responsibilities in any kind of way, there's a mental load that exists, and there can often be an inequitable division of that work. Um, and so I hear from women in their 20s, they'll come to me and say, like, thank God you're talking about this. My coworker actually texted me the other day and she's like, I literally just had to talk about domestic labor and like equitable use of this in my own home today. And I used some of your like content. And I was like, oh, that's great. Good. So I think first and foremost, this happens early in relationships and in all kinds of relationships. I have heard from people from all walks of life, from all kinds of different relationships, queer, straight, single family homes, divorced homes, co-parenting homes, that this exists. And oftentimes it just differs. It just differs based on a couple of factors. The things that really play into this are employment. If one person is viewed as having a more important job or making more money, then the dynamic can be very different. If they're in a co-parenting relationship where one parent has more custody than the other, they tend to carry more of the domestic load or mental load, even when they're not caring for the kids. And so I've definitely seen that. And this happens in heterosexual couples too, right? I've heard women come to me and say, like, yeah, my wife is like the man in the relationship. They'll say he's like the guy in the relationship. She's not doing anything. And it's not just heteronormative. We often do talk about it in heteronormative context, or I do,
Mm-hmm.
because I have data to back it up. I can say, like, if you look at this graph, you can see that women are doing 4x the amount of caretaking in a week than their male partners are. I'm sure and I hope that we'll continue to have more data about same-sex couples and even, divorced couples or single family homes too, because I think it's so important for everyone to know that this is not unique to heteronormative relationships. Unfortunately, I think that's just the overwhelming amount of the data points that we have to point to
Yeah.
talk about these things. But no, it's happening in every relationship. It's happening in workplaces. It's happening in all different ways.
It feels so crushingly patriarchal for me to, even I, without kids, I'm defaulting this conversation to being cisgendered
Yeah.
motherhood in a heterosexual relationship. And I'm trying to pull myself out of it. And it's hard because I'm trained to even look at it as there's a binary here, but there's really
Mhm.
not. You're so spot on here. Like, the mental load is a thing can be that is on all of us in some way or situation. It doesn't just appear when you become a mother if you are a woman who has a heterosexual relationship. And it's it's just so it's so interesting how hard I'm trying to fight my brain to think differently about it, and like
Mhm.
the ingrained systems and like labels we've put on ourselves and our relationships and our places in society. It's
Yeah.
this is a fascinating conversation. Paige, before we go, I would really like to hear from you. What do you want to become out of having this conversation? Like,
Yeah.
what do you see happening? Maybe it's 5 years, 10 years, or another generation from now.
Yeah, I don't know if we can, I hope we could, but I don't know if we can do anything sweeping with this generation. But I just hope that the conversation becomes more normalized,
Mm.
that people in relationships are able to have conversations about what equity means in a relationship, but also in the workplace. I think until truly, we know that there are things that exist like the wage gap or the motherhood penalty in the workplace. Those things will not change until there's equity at home, right? There is no incentive to change those things. There's no incentive to offer paid maternity leave. Or paternity leave. There's no offer to, put money behind affordable childcare or just access to childcare at all. None of those things will come to fruition as long as we continue to prioritize, these gendered norms of men putting their time and efforts towards money and being a provider and women being the caretakers. And what we didn't talk about, and even in that context of the patriarchy, is just also kind of the fact that we are two white women talking about this, but people of color, women of color, are disproportionately impacted by this. And historically, white women pass this kind of work off to women of color and still do when they outsource this kind of work, when they outsource domestic labor. And so that's still a really important part of this conversation as well. And so I do believe the more we talk about this, the more we normalize this, the more we bring it to the forefront, the more we're able to change policies and change the way that we value unpaid labor and paid labor, right? Across genders, across races. But until we normalize it, it will continue to be this quiet, invisible thing that women are told to count their blessings for, and nothing will change. So I do hope that we see actual, systemic change for everyone in the future. But in particular, I think women are disproportionately impacted by this.
For sure. Such a great point that you made. It reminded me of when in 2020, when a lot of the world blew up, it feels like, but when there's a lot of conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement,
Mhm.
I don't think I've ever heard this articulated, but I immediately thought of, yes, people of color and particularly women of color have had to take on the mental load that white women who are more privileged are able to pass on or dump onto them. And also in terms of people of color having to educate
Mhm.
white people or non-people of color on their own life experience,
Yeah.
that is a mental load. And
Mhm.
that's something that I haven't heard any of the educators that I follow use that term, but now I'm going to keep my eyes peeled on some of the other folks that I follow if they've been using that term, because it's so spot on. There's a lot of privilege tied in whether or not you have to carry the mental load or if you can
Mhm.
pass the buck, or
Yeah.
even with money pay to pass it off. But there's still um, there's a lot of weight and strain carried with that. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
rambling now.
No, I'm with you.
But it's a fascinating topic, right? I mean,
It is.
it can get so micro and it can get so macro at the same time.
Yes, 100%.
So, Paige, I love talking with you. Obviously, I want everybody to go follow you and find out more about you. Where can those listening follow you, see what you're up to, and learn more?
Yeah, my main platforms are TikTok and Instagram at She is a Paige Turner. I have a website as well where you can kind of see where I've spoken on this topic in other places. But yeah, you'll find me online. I'm pretty much there almost every day, talking about this as well as other things.
She is a Paige Turner. Love that handle. Paige,
Thank you.
thank you so much for joining me today. What a treat to have you here.
Thank you.
Wow, my head is buzzing with thoughts, more questions, things I want to discuss with Paige. This is a huge topic and one that we probably could have talked about forever. Thank you again to Paige Turner for chatting with me today. I am fascinated by this topic and I'm so glad she could take the time to share with all of you about it. In the meantime, if you haven't already, please open up that podcast app right now and hit the subscribe button. Share this episode with a friend, someone who you think could use a little help getting some support around the mental load. Trust me, we all are struggling with it. And if you haven't already, please rate and review this podcast. It is so helpful for your ratings and reviews. It's how I can get awesome guests like Paige to come back to this podcast. Thank you again so much for listening. It means so much to me. I hope that this was a helpful podcast episode for you today. And in the meantime, I'll see you next week on How We Belong. Bye.